The Where Our Minds Wander podcast may contain sensitive content and explicit language. Listener discretion is advised. Greetings, fellow wanderers, to the places our minds wander.
The house at the end of the dirt road, where disembodied voices whisper and strange sounds make the living shiver.
Where shadows lurk at the edge of the woods, just outside your back door. And mysterious lights speed beyond reason across the clear night sky.
Odd events throughout time that lead you down the rabbit hole.
I'm Wes.
And I'm Beth.
And this is Where Our Minds Wander. Hello and welcome to Where Our Minds Wander, all you fellow wanderers. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, everybody.
It feels so good to be back in the studio to bring you all a new episode. And with that said, we have noticed that we have some new listeners. So we would like to welcome all of you to the Wanderers family.
Yes, welcome.
And if you haven't had a chance yet, check out our website at whereourmindswander.com. There's links there to our books, our TeePublic store, and if you like what you hear, you can always leave us a rating and a review on our website. We would thoroughly appreciate it.
We would. We always appreciate a nice review.
Yeah, they're nice to read.
They do. They make our day, basically.
They really do. People really don't realize how much we like reading our reviews. It's pretty sad, but hey, you know, it's nice to see that people appreciate what we do.
Well, yeah, and that, maybe we're doing something right. Maybe.
Well, we're still here.
Right.
We haven't been canceled yet.
Speaking of canceled, the wind out there is wicked right now, so hopefully we can edit it out of the episode if you can hear the windows rattling and the...
Yes, we're experiencing a high windstorm, and it's battering this old Victorian home tonight. The windows are rattling, and the roof is shaking a bit. And a little while ago, I actually felt the house kind of bend.
That's never good.
You could feel it. You could see it moving a bit.
I have felt the chair that I was sitting in kind of vibrate a little. That's unnerving when the wind is blowing really hard.
Yeah, we're supposed to get up to 50 miles an hour. Well, with that all said, we have a pretty good episode for you all tonight.
And after you listen to tonight's episode, if you'd like to know more about the topic that we covered, you can always check our sources in our show notes because there's a ton more information there that generally we can't fit into one of our episodes. So it's a great place for you to go and do some of your own research.
That there is. All right, all you wanderers, sit back, get cozy, and Beth's going to start us off.
All right, so if we asked all of you listeners to think of the most haunted place in the entire United States, what's the first place that comes to mind? Is it the Stanley Hotel? Is it the Lizzie Borden house? Or maybe you thought of entire towns like Gettysburg or New Orleans. But how many of you immediately thought of the massive former sanatorium that looms over the landscape of Louisville, Kentucky, where thousands of people passed away? It's the place that paranormal investigators have long considered the ultimate hotspot of activity, where shadow people literally fill the halls, disembodied voices scream in the night, people are touched while in the terrifying body shoot, and toys seem to move on their own. That place is Waverly Hills Sanatorium. And for me, I've been fascinated by Waverly Hills for about 5 years. And I'm so interested in Waverly Hills that I actually wrote a book based on the place, although I didn't call it that in my book. And if you've listened to a couple of our episodes, then you know by now that history is really important to us. We're as diligent as we can be about getting the history of a place correct. And we always try to debunk the urban legends and misinformation about a haunted location. It's important to me personally because I just think it's the right thing to do, getting a person's story right.
Yeah, well said. Because, we joke around and I goof around, say some goofy shit sometimes. But we take our history pretty seriously.
It's important to me. I don't know. It's just an innate thing that I care about.
Yeah, to try to get people's stories as right as possible.
Because they deserve it.
They do.
Waverly Hills is one of those places that has an incredibly rich but tragic history. And maybe that's why it's also surrounded by urban legend. For example, there's the story of the nurse who committed suicide. I mean, it was a tuberculosis clinic where thousands of people died, so of course there's a nurse that committed suicide story. So tonight we're going to talk about Waverly Hills, and we're going to try and be as accurate as we can be. And as always, I want to start with the history and question some of those stories that may or may not be true. And then Wes is going to dive into the hauntings, which I'm sure you're all going to want to hear, because Waverly Hills is, without a doubt, one of the most haunted places in the entire country. So I don't know why Waverly Hills speaks to me. I never had any family there, as far as I know, and I've never actually been there myself. But for some reason that I can't explain, I'm just completely drawn to the stories of the people who did live there. And, Wes and I have watched pretty much every ghost hunting show that has ever visited there, but we've also watched every non-paranormal documentary that we've been able to find about Waverly Hills. So, without further ado, I'm going to get into the history. The very first building on the land where Waverly Hills sits was the country home of Major Thomas Hercules Hayes. At the risk of sounding like a history lesson, which my husband sometimes accuses me of.
Hey.
Well, you do.
Well, you do go off.
A little bit, sometimes. But I do want to tell you all a little bit about Major Hayes. He was a career military man, and he fought on the side of the Confederates during the Civil War. He captured a train at Lebanon Junction and burned both the Louisville and Nashville bridges to stave off the Union forces. He became major of the 6th Kentucky Infantry and led them into the Battle of Shiloh. He was Assistant General on the staff of General William Preston and Inspector General of the Orphan Brigade under the command of his brother-in-law, Benjamin H. Helm. Helm, who was, interestingly, also Abraham Lincoln's brother-in-law, died from his wounds at the Battle of Chickamauga. The Orphan Brigade, in case you've never heard of it, was the nickname given to the 1st Kentucky Brigade because at the time Kentucky was neutral and under Union control, so the Confederate soldiers of the 1st Kentucky were unable to return home. After the end of the Civil War, Major Hayes became heavily involved in politics and he practiced law, as well as investing in the railroad and mining industries. Wanting a place to get away and relax, he bought a farm in Louisville in 1883. But he and his second wife had several daughters, and the nearest schoolhouse was 4 miles away. So he talked to his neighbor, who owned a small abandoned building at the bottom of a hill, and they agreed to let Hayes turn it into a 1-room schoolhouse for his children and all the neighboring farm children. The first school teacher was a young lady named Lizzie Harris, who boarded with the Hayes family. In her free time, she loved to sit on the front porch of the farmhouse and read novels by Sir Walter Scott. So it was Lizzie who suggested that the schoolhouse be named Waverly. Hayes was so taken by the idea that he named his entire farm Waverly Hills. By the year 1900, Louisville was filled with people suffering from a rampant and highly contagious disease, tuberculosis. TB can affect all different parts of the body, including the bones and skin. But pulmonary TB, a disease of the lungs, was highly contagious, and for most who contracted it, deadly. The newly formed Tuberculosis Board of Louisville asked the aging Hayes if he'd be willing to sell his farm to them. It was chosen, according to the Kentucky Historic Sites website, due to its high elevation with good airflow and its beautiful views of the surrounding area. Hayes agreed, and on July 26, 1910, Waverly Hills Sanatorium opened its doors to its first patients. Many of them had actually camped out on the lawn in tents for weeks since the city hospital refused to admit them. The sanatorium was simply 2 open-air pavilions connected to a 2-story wooden main building. It could house 40 patients, 20 men on one side and 20 women on the other. It cost $25,000 to build. In 1915, a children's pavilion containing 50 beds was added. But the city of Louisville realized that the capacity just wasn't enough, and within 16 years, a new facility had to be constructed. This one, which opened in October of 1926, was a 180,000 square foot, 5-story brick building that could hold 400 patients. According to the Paranormal Activity Investigators website, the new facility included 4 stories of patient rooms, a cafeteria and kitchen, an operating room, and plenty of solarium porch space on each floor for the patients. On the 5th floor was the heliotherapy department, where those suffering from tuberculosis of the bone could be treated with sunlight. There was also a rooftop swing set for the children, a nurse's station, a kitchenette, and access to the elevator maintenance in what is now known as the bell tower. Each patient room had its own telephone, radio, and solarium porch. But I do want to mention that Waverly Hills was a segregated facility. Only white patients were housed in the new building. Black patients remained in the original wooden structure. And this was new information for me. I had no idea. And you and I talked about this the other night, where I was like, of course it was segregated. But none of the documentaries we have ever watched on Waverly has ever mentioned that fact.
Yeah, I find that unusually odd.
That they've never mentioned it?
Yeah, why wouldn't you? It's part of the history.
Well, they don't want to mention it, I guess. I don't know.
Well, sometimes history is uncomfortable.
Right.
And it's part of the history, and it needs to be said.
Right. My only thought when I found out was that I hope that the black patients were treated as well as the white patients, even though I know they were in a shittier building. I hope they received the same quality of care, which is unlikely. TB was still a highly contagious disease, and administrators at Waverly knew that every time deliveries were made to the facility, they ran the risk of someone else catching it. And so they decided to become as completely self-sufficient as they possibly could. Eventually, they also had their own laundry, butchery, vegetable gardens, water treatment facility, and post office. The medical staff actually lived on site as well. although a 1958 article in the Courier Journal mentions that employees were made to pay $50 a month in room and board, whether they lived on site or not. Staff entered and exited the building through a series of tunnels, 500 feet of them, and necessary outside deliveries were also brought up through the tunnels. It was also frequently used to carry out the bodies of the patients who passed away. This is how the tunnel earned its nickname, the body chute. As horrific as that sounds, it was actually used this way as a form of kindness. Administrators at Waverly didn't want other patients to become alarmed or saddened by the number of friends and loved ones who had passed away, and they thought that taking the bodies out unseen was the kinder and better thing to do. The death toll at Waverly hovers between 8,000 and 60,000, depending on the source. Keep in mind that the cure for TB wasn't discovered until 1943, and it didn't become available at Waverly for another 6 years in 1949. So, between 1910 and 1949, patients at Waverly received all kinds of treatments with varying results. There were heat treatments where heat lamps, called Finsen lamps, were directed at specific parts of a patient's body where they might have lupus vulgaris, or reddish-brown patches or nodules on their skin from the disease. The Finsen lamps did seem to make a difference in treating the skin issues. There were also cold treatments, where patients were wrapped in blankets and left on stretchers or lounge chairs to take in the bracing cold air. It was generally believed that fresh air was the best cure, and people often traveled to colder climates to try and cure themselves. Since pretty much everyone received this treatment, it doesn't seem like it necessarily worked all that well. There was the thought that good food and mild exercise was the best treatment, and patients at Waverly received both on a daily basis. Then there was also the artificial pneumothorax. When a doctor would surgically collapse an infected lung in the belief that letting it rest would help it heal. This treatment was highly controversial and highly dangerous. Its success rate was questionable at best. U.S. Ghost Adventures also says that patients may have also had lymph nodes removed or parts of their lungs removed in the hopes that it would foster healing, or they might have 7 or 8 ribs removed to allow the infected lungs more room to expand. These treatments, which are barbaric by today's standards, were basically pointless, although at the time medical professionals were doing the best they could with a disease that they could not cure. Being diagnosed with TB was terrifying. People understandably feared catching it, and those suffering from it were taken away from their families and sent to places like Waverly Hills. It was a horrible situation with dire consequences, and I'm positive that many of the patients were homesick and had more than one moment of hopelessness. In addition, segregating the facility wasn't right. A 1957 Courier Journal article shows a photo of one Black employee in his living quarters. The man, Joseph Logan, had been employed at Waverly for 22 years, and his quarters were definitely subpar. Separate but not equal was the case at Waverly Hills. But I do believe the staff cared for their patients and about their patients. Many of the dedicated nurses actually ended up catching TB themselves, and they became patients. I do believe the staff did their best to make Waverly a place of happiness and light in whatever small ways that they could. Friendships were formed and camaraderie existed. If you watch any of the documentaries about Waverly Hills that include actual footage, many of the patients are surprisingly smiling, and they look as though they are experiencing at least a moment of happiness. Thankfully, streptomycin was discovered in 1943, although it took 6 years to make it to Waverly Hills. By 1960, TB was no longer the death sentence that it once was. Waverly Hills Sanatorium closed in 1961. In 1962, it reopened as Woodhaven Geriatric Center, a nursing home for elderly dementia patients or those with mobility issues. But I have to say, finding information on Woodhaven was very difficult. I found mention after mention of it being shut down by the state of Kentucky in 1982 for criminal negligence and abuse. However, I couldn't find a single newspaper article about it that I didn't have to pay to read. So I know very little about those 2 decades, other than patients were not always treated with kindness or respect. I would go so far as to say that they were treated inhumanely if the state had to come in and shut them down and pressed charges. DiscoverAmericaBlog.com says that Woodhaven was chronically understaffed and overcrowded. The state forcibly shut it down due to cockroach infestation, patient neglect, unsanitary living conditions, and evidence of medical malpractice. Despite being purchased by a developer the following year who had plans of turning it into a prison, and when that fell through, an apartment complex, Waverly Hills sat, pretty much abandoned, until it was sold again in 1996 to Robert Alberhasky. According to a Courier-Journal article from November 10, 1996, Alberhasky purchased Waverly Hills because he planned to build a 155-foot-tall stainless steel statue of Jesus Christ balanced on a globe. Alberhasky was the founder of the Christ the Redeemer Foundation, Incorporated, and based on the success of similar statues around the world, he hoped to raise money to build his statue, which would be 35 feet taller than its inspiration, the Christ the Redeemer statue in Rio de Janeiro. He wanted to build it as a way to bring Christian tourists to Louisville. He also wanted to convert the main building of the sanatorium into a chapel, a theater, and a gift shop, according to the Kentucky Historic Sites website. The entire project would cost about $12 million, but after only fundraising $3,000 for the project, Alberhasky was forced to abandon his plan. Waverly Hills sat, abandoned, left to vandals and decay, for another 4 years. In 2001, Waverly Hills was purchased by Tina and Charlie Mattingly. They established the Waverly Hills Historical Society 2 years later and have dedicated the last 24 years to restoring the sanatorium. They offer both historical tours and paranormal investigation packages as a way to fund the restoration and conservation. So if you've ever watched any ghost hunting show where they've gone to Waverly, then you've most likely seen Tina Mattingly. So before I hand off to Wes, I want to mention just one more thing. The official Waverly Hills Sanatorium Woodhaven Geriatric Center Memorial and Historical Resource website is an incredible site to visit. They've done a painstaking job at compiling alphabetized lists of hundreds of patients of both Waverly Hills and Woodhaven. They also have lists of the doctors and nurses who were on staff there, as well as a photo gallery of archival photos. I'm not going to lie, it is very sobering to look through, but it's also pretty remarkable because, I want to give people their stories back, and I hate the idea of anyone being forgotten. And this website has made huge strides to prevent that from happening. There's also the Kentucky Death Index website that is very informative. You can see yearly lists of patients who passed away at Waverly Hills from 1919 all the way up to 1960, which Wes will talk about in a little bit. So, all right, when we come back, Wes will get into why Waverly Hills is considered one of the most haunted places in the entire country. And I have to say, it truly does have everything, including an entity known as the Creeper.
And we'll be back right after this quick break.
Hey, did you know? Napoleon wasn't the only world leader to be attacked by rabbits. On April 20th, 1979, U.S. President Jimmy Carter was fishing from a John boat in his Georgia pond when a swamp rabbit came barreling towards him, jumped into the water, quote, hissing menacingly, its teeth flashing and nostrils flared, and swam aggressively towards his boat. Swamp rabbits are known to be rather territorial, and it will enter the water if threatened. The former president merely splashed water towards the angry bunny, and it swam off. Who'd have thunk it?
All right, we're back. And as Beth was saying before the break, Waverly Hills has had the reputation of being one of the most haunted places in the entire country for a good reason. It's kind of hard to know where to even start, whether to go by the type of haunting or to just describe all the paranormal activity that is said to take place on each floor, or to start with the spirits that may not be who people say they are. The stories of ghosts at Waverly Hills seems to begin during the years when the facility was abandoned. Trespassers would tell stories of seeing shadow people, seeing unexplained lights, and hearing disembodied voices. Objects apparently moved on their own, and shadow people literally filled the hallways. So I guess the best place to start would be the roof, which may sound funny, but the roof was used for heliotherapy, or getting people out into the sunlight. And it was also where some of the children liked to play. Visitors have reported hearing the eerie sound of children singing Ring Around the Rosie while up on the roof. But the roof is also where the story of Timmy O'Shea begins. The common story about Timmy is that he was living in the children's pavilion while both of his parents were patients with stage 3 tuberculosis. He would often play ball on the roof. Then one day, he either fell, or even worse, was pushed off the roof, where he fell to his death. In all the stories about Timmy, a year is never given. Tuberculosis is not classified as stage 1, 2, or 3, so it's difficult to tell if Timmy's parents were in the active or the most fatal stage of the disease. But I guess we have to assume that they were. Now, I think it should be said that Beth spent almost an hour combing through the Kentucky Death Index website from 1919 until 1960 for Waverly Hills, and did not find a single O'Shea on the list. She did find an O. Henry and an O'Banion, but no O'Sheas. So there's no official record online of Timmy or his parents ever being at Waverly Hills or dying there. Of course, it's possible that over the years, Timmy's last name has been lost. And it's possible that if a small boy died on the property due to such a horrific accident, that it might not have reported the same way as the deaths caused by TB. It's also possible that he was there prior to the 1919 start date for the index. But the bottom line is that she couldn't find any records of him at all. And yet, there is a spirit at Waverly Hills that people have been interacting with for years, that they believe is a young boy named Timmy. Visitors have left balls and other toys all over the building for Timmy to play with, and he often interacts with them, either rolling a ball back down the dark hallway or even throwing it back towards whoever tosses it lightly down the hall. This phenomenon is a pretty common occurrence, and so is the sound of children playing hide-and-seek throughout the building. So, although we don't have any proof that Timmy O'Shea ever lived at Waverly, there are countless stories of interactions with a childlike spirit. Another spirit tied to an urban legend is the nurse who haunts the infamous Room 502. Easily considered the most haunted spot at Waverly, Room 502 is known for disembodied voices telling visitors to get out, and for EVPs of a female voice. Visitors often report feeling sick or not right when they are in Room 502, and the apparition of a nurse in a white uniform has reportedly been seen. According to legend, the nurse is Mary Hillenberg. Mary's story, and there are several versions of Mary's story, is almost a cliché. She was 28 or 29 years old in 1928 and became pregnant by one of the doctors. One version says that she hung herself using a broom placed across a metal ceiling pipe just inside the nurse's station, Room 502. Another version says she suffered a botched abortion and then either took her own life or died during this procedure, and the doctor staged it to look like a suicide. Over the years, Mary's story has changed drastically. First, Room 502 was not the nurse's station. It was a patient bathroom next to the nurse's station. So the story changed to include that detail. Then it turned out that the pipe that Mary allegedly used to hang herself from wasn't installed until the 1970s. And then the story changed again, saying that Mary hung herself in the foyer area just outside Room 502. So perhaps the details were wrong. But out of curiosity, Beth decided to look at the staff list on the website she mentioned earlier, and she did not find anyone with the last name Hillenberg on the list. Searching for newspaper articles didn't lead to anything either. So perhaps Mary's story is wrong, and whoever the female spirit is in Room 502 still doesn't have the correct history or name. Or possibly, Mary Hillenberg did work at Waverly, and her death was covered up. It's impossible to know for sure.
And frustrating, I have to jump in and say.
Well, I can imagine.
Because you know that I like to give some truth to these stories, and, I couldn't find any.
Yeah, it makes it really hard when you're trying to verify these people and their existence at this place. But, continuing. Whoever the female spirit is in Room 502, she's known to be very active. And if it's not Mary, it could be the ghost of the nurse who jumped from the window of Room 502 in 1932. That story, by the way, has also never been confirmed. According to FrightFind.com, visitors to Room 502 experience unexplained cold spots and have even had objects thrown at them. EVP recordings have included the sound of a chair being dragged across the floor and the phrase, "Get back." Not being able to prove the existence of Timmy O'Shea or Mary Hillenberg through historical records does not make Waverly Hills any less haunted. The experiences people have said to have there certainly seems to prove that it quite possibly is. According to USGhostAdventures.com, people have heard disembodied footsteps, moans, screams, and relentless coughing. They've heard what sounds like surgeries taking place and the sounds of children laughing. Doors are said to slam on their own. And more than once, people have reported seeing strange lights inside the building, on floors where there is no electricity. Sometimes these lights almost seem to shimmer, or they float like orbs. At other times, it's as if someone has turned a light on inside a room and illuminated it completely. Unexplained faces have been spotted peering out through windows. People have reported the feeling of being touched and pushed. And they've also reported that they feel like someone has taken hold of their hand as they walk through the empty corridors. The number of apparitions seen at Waverly is astounding. There is said to be a man in a white coat that seems to stay in the kitchen. He is often accompanied by the smell of baking bread, according to LittleHouseOfHorrors.com. There's reportedly also a doctor in a white lab coat that walks repeatedly into his former operating room on the 4th floor. The apparition of a man and a dog have been seen wandering the grounds. Tina Mattingly, the current owner, has talked about seeing this apparition herself. More disturbing, though, are the reports of the entities in the body chute and the creeper. Seeing shadow people at Waverly is probably the most common type of paranormal activity that happens there. Some have even set off motion detectors. But the entity known as the creeper seems to be something entirely different. Described as a towering black mass, but also a twisted shadow creature, the creeper seems to climb the walls and to crawl across the ceilings upside down. According to FrightFind.com, people who have seen the creeper claim that its arms and legs are twisted in a grotesque way, and it crawls along the floors as well. Those who spot this terrifying entity on the 4th floor are filled with a sense of doom or dread, and in a few cases, they've had to leave the building for several hours before they can calm down and come back in. Some have speculated that the creeper is a manifestation of all the hopelessness and anger that accumulated over the years at Waverly Hills. Others say that it's the manifestation of one or more of the mentally disturbed patients housed in the building during the Woodhaven days. However, Waverly Hills never had a mental health ward, and neither did Woodhaven. So whatever the creeper is, it doesn't communicate directly with the living. Instead, it does its best to make people feel frightened. But for many, the most frightening spot at Waverly Hills is the body chute, also known as the death tunnel. The service tunnel is 525 feet long, and as Beth said earlier, employees would use it to bring up goods that were delivered from other parts of the city. There, they would load the goods into the mini railway cars inside the tunnel and guide them up the steep incline. Employees also used that as an entrance in some cases. The tunnel is as old as the building itself. It was initially built during the original construction to haul supplies up from the railway station to the top of Waverly Hill. Eventually, the main use for the body chute became a hidden way to transport the bodies of those who had died away from the main building. They'd strap the body to a gurney and then slowly walk it down the steep chute by using a rope and a pulley system. Administration at Waverly Hills thought that removing the bodies this way was the best thing to do for the other patients' morale. Some sites will make outlandish claims like they were transporting a body an hour through the body chute. Now, I think it's pretty safe to say that that's just not true. The highest number of deaths in 1 year at Waverly was 153, and that was immediately after World War II when soldiers returned home from war carrying the disease.
Yeah, so for those sites to claim that they were, getting rid of, that they were transporting a body every hour is just ridiculous. There's no way that was happening.
Yeah, it seems really outlandish. So, thousands of bodies were taken away through the body chute, but if you think about it logically, there is no way it was one every hour. Now, as you can probably imagine, The body chute freaks a lot of people out because while they're inside it, it's pretty hard to not think about the thousands of bodies that were taken through it. And it doesn't help that people often hear the door between the tunnel and the main building slam, or disembodied moaning or knocking on the walls and pipes. Light anomalies have been seen in the pitch-black tunnel during investigations, and EVPs have been recorded that say words like pain and leave now. Often people report feeling watched and hearing the sounds of someone quickly approaching them from behind, and then passing them and continuing to walk down the tunnel.
That's got to be the creepiest thing, to be sitting there and hearing somebody walking up behind you and then walking past you and then continuing to walk away. That's got to be very creepy.
Yeah, that would be a bit unnerving.
Yeah.
In 2022, a group visiting Waverly Hills had to be evacuated into the body chute because of a tornado warning. According to the news article, the tunnel is thought to be the safest place on the property during a tornado. The group was there for several hours, and everyone was perfectly safe. However, they also didn't experience anything that they couldn't explain, they said. In recent years, Waverly Hills has been used as a temporary training site for both state police and the Kentucky National Guard. In 2017, the National Guard held a 2-day hazardous waste retrieval training there. Although several of the guardsmen and women commented on the creepiness of the place, no one claimed to have any paranormal experiences. Yet thousands of people a year claim to have them. More recent apparition encounter stories include a phantom hearse parked at the back of the building, as well as the apparition of a woman with bleeding wrist in the solarium. The bleeding wrist woman has become quite a common report on various social media platforms lately, and I have never heard of her before.
Yeah, she's definitely a new one because I have never heard of her before.
Not at all.
Or the hearse.
I have heard claims of the hearse being parked out back.
Okay.
And seeing an apparition. But as far as the bleeding wrist woman, nope, it's a first for me. But I have heard of electronic equipment going haywire at Waverly Hills for quite a long time now. Despite not having electricity in the main building since the 1980s, it's been a known fact that, for years, EMF detectors will spike all over the facility. According to the Paranormal Activity Investigators website, which does a pretty good job at debunking urban legends, people have had their cell phones short out and the internal components have actually melted. They've had batteries in their cameras and portable generators drain from 100% to nothing within minutes. Other sites have mentioned drained batteries also, as well as strange glitches in their audio and video recordings. There isn't really a good explanation, other than something about the building just messes with those things, whether it's physical, environmental, or somehow, possibly, spiritual. It's really impossible to say.
You know, Waverly Hills is such an important historical building, like just historically, that I think it deserves to be preserved as a museum, you know, a place where people's stories are not forgotten. And sometimes I worry that the hype over the hauntings takes away from that, especially when paranormal investigations and a seasonal haunted house is the way that the current owners are able to finance its upkeep. But at the same time, if Waverly Hills is half as haunted as the stories make it out to be, then it really truly is one of the most haunted places in the United States. So I think it's like the prime location for there to be some actual scientific study about the nature of ghosts and what exactly is happening when people are having experiences there.
I don't think you could have said it any better. Now, I love that these old buildings with such rich histories are being preserved or taken care of. The downside to that is that a lot of times they are claimed to be haunted. People come in and start using that as a way to generate money and quite possibly hype up the hauntings, because that's how they're financing restoring this old building.
Right. So you have to keep the stories going in order to bring in more people to make more money.
And sometimes in there, people's stories become blurred from fact to fantasy.
Or even multiple stories are being combined and we have no idea that that's what's, we don't know.
Things are just being made up because, well, the history is lost and, well, who can say otherwise?
Right. But if it's a place where you want to go just to experience a paranormal experience and you don't really care about the history, which I'm sure there are some people like that. That's not us, but
it's the place to go.
It's the place to go. Yeah.
I really wish somebody would go in there and do a scientific experiment.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm not saying with all the gadgets, because you know how I feel about that. I don't believe in the light-up tripwires.
The REM pods.
The REM pods. For those people out there that truly want to find out if there's something on the other side and communicate with it, I think we need to strip away all this garbage.
That can be activated by cell phones.
Or other means. And we've seen them debunked over and over and over. Yet, a lot of people think that's what you do to communicate with a spirit.
Right.
Not that you can prove it does or doesn't, but it is a way to sell these devices to people.
Right.
I just love EVP.
Mm-hmm.
You can't screw with an EVP recorder. You just can't do it.
Right.
It's done in real time. The ghost box, we have one. They're cute, but it's a waste of money if you really want to seriously go about it. It's just picking up radio stations, whether frontwards or backwards or what.
It's entertaining for 5 minutes, but it's never been a way to communicate, at least not for us.
No.
EVPs, just playing a digital voice recorder and catching things, catching voices and phrases and people walking across your hotel room.
Right.
That, there's zero explanation for.
Yeah. Now, we're not saying for those of you out there who like these devices, by all means, go ahead and use them. I'm just a purist. I really want some form of contact with the other side, and I want that contact to be real and that I've debunked it knowing that I've had a real experience. Because, I've had tons of experiences, but then you go back and you think about them and say, well, did that really happen? Did I see that? What was the possibilities? You didn't take the time to really debunk it well in that moment.
Well, even, was it last night or the night before? You were sitting in the living room and I was sitting in the room we call the parlor, which sounds a little snooty, but that's what it is. It's an old house. And behind me in the kitchen, I heard somebody sneeze. And I said to you, I just heard what sounded like somebody sneeze in the kitchen.
Right.
And 100% that is what I heard. And then you said, well, was it this? And you cleared your nose. You did something with your nose. And I was like, no. And then, of course, the more I thought about it, I was like, well, maybe it really was him in the living room. And somehow the sound bounced behind into the,
Which could have happened.
It could have been.
The wind was blowing. It could have carried it into the house. The wind was blowing pretty hard that night. And as you know, we were stating before, the wind was just bending this place. Mm-hmm. You could feel it bend.
Yeah.
So perhaps that helped carry something I did.
Or I heard somebody sneeze in the kitchen.
Right.
But there's no way to determine one way or the other.
And we've had all kinds of experiences here, but you can't 100% say that they're real.
Right. But we have never run the digital voice recorder in this house.
No, we haven't.
Mostly because your wife is afraid of what she'll hear.
Right. But we've had the experiences of what feels like a cat jumping on the bed at night.
Yes, I
and
did.
cuddling in.
Yes.
We've heard voices.
Yes.
We hear strange footsteps.
We do hear walking through this house quite a bit.
But then we live in an area that there's a lot of echo outside, too, coming off homes that are brick around here. And it does, it reverberates.
Yeah. Sound is very strangely distorted from outside into our house.
Yeah. So, to section off maybe a portion at Waverly, really lock it up from the outside, clear everyone out. Just you and a co-investigator, put security around the whole place, and then really try to get some good communication.
Leave your phones in another room and don't have any walkies on you.
Yeah, that's what bothers me about a lot of these shows. They always have their cell phones on them, or Apple wristwatch. You figure that the lighting and camera people have cell phones on them. There shouldn't be none of that.
Right.
And they'll rush to the window after they've seen something. They'll go, well, did anybody see anything out on the ground? So they're looking from up there, and they're looking down. It's like, well, they could have gone by now. Why not cordon off the entire building? Get everything out of there. Have people monitoring everything outside for any light anomalies, any sounds coming in, and then really just making sure nobody enters that building whatsoever. Just use your EVP recorders and see what you get.
See what you get. Can you tell how impassioned we are about Waverly Hills?
Well, I think investigations should be lockdowns, and that the entire area, inside and out, they know no one's coming in or out.
Right.
There's just too much that could possibly contaminate your evidence. I really wish people would do it the way it should be done, scientifically.
Yes, except that if it's televised, it's going to take weeks.
Months
to get any sort of response. And you can't go to a place for 4 days and then put it into a half-hour television show if you don't have anything.
I would much rather investigate a place for months on end and perhaps get one piece of evidence that you can say definitely came from something otherworldly than a whole bunch of moans and groans and things over a recorder that you think it said something that it didn't.
Or little lights flickering when you...
Oh my God, don't even get me on the little lights. It's all such malarkey. But people love the shows. We love watching them for entertainment and picking apart what they don't seem to. It's hype.
And we always say that we watch it too because they go to really interesting places.
Yeah.
And we like to see all
the history of the places.
Yeah, the history and just places we've never been that we didn't even maybe know about.
And I've seen some things on some of the ghost shows that are absolutely, they look like they've caught an entity on camera.
Yes.
No disputing it.
Yes. Ghost hunters specifically have caught figures, legs, and corners of dresses. And, it's like spine. I get shivers, whole body shivers when, they catch something like that.
I wish Houdini was still around.
Houdini?
Yes.
The great debunker?
That's right. I'd like to know what he would think of these modern day ghost shows.
Oh, he'd have a lot to say, I'm sure. Once he understood, television.
Yeah.
Although they had movies, so of course he, cameras and stuff, but...
And some of these mediums.
Yeah. Yeah.
There are truly some gifted mediums.
There are a handful, yes.
Yeah. That really just make you scratch your head. And then there's the rest of them, well...
Yeah.
They make for good TV.
Right. Which is entertaining and which is why we watch them.
Yeah. Well... I think we've said a mouthful this episode.
I know. That was a lot. We just let it all out for this one.
Well, we usually don't give our opinions on anything. Nobody wants to offend anybody.
Right.
But if you're into the paranormal, as much as we are, it's a part of history. From way back, people have been having paranormal experiences. we finally probably have the technology that we could prove it.
Yeah. So let's do it, people.
And let's do it right.
Yes.
All right. With that said, hopefully you'll listen again next week for another episode of Where Our Minds Wander.
we haven't made anybody angry and lost a bunch of you because you don't agree with us. But
And you don't have to.
No, I mean, come back because we talk about really cool places and you might hear about a place that you may have never heard of before.
No. And everyone's entitled to their opinion.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's the way family is.
Exactly.
All right. You want to tell them about our sources?
Yes, there are a bunch of sources in our show notes this week, all about Waverly Hills. A ton of newspaper articles. You can check out those patient indexes and staff indexes and look at the photographs and just go research Waverly because it's so incredibly interesting.
Yeah, I know many of you probably watched all the ghost shows and everything like that, but go ahead and research it for yourself because there's a lot more that you'll find.
Absolutely.
All right, with that said, join us again next week for an all-new episode of Where Our Minds Wander.
See you soon. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to traveling with you again to the places where our minds wander.
If you like what you heard, please take a moment and provide us with a 5-star rating and a comment on your favorite listening platform. It really helps us move up the list and become more visible on the podcast charts so new people can find us.
And thank you all for your continued support.
See you next week for an all-new episode.